Hey team, Will Cobb here, and I'm here to give a Lightroom tutorial for film photographers and for any beginner photographers that are out there looking to get their start and get going with Lightroom. Now this tutorial is going to walk through my process. There's a lot of different ways that you can go about this, but for me this is what I do for my professional workflow and for my film photography scanning workflow. So I'm going to show a lot about that. If you don't know how to scan your film photography and get this digitized, I have several videos on that of both DSLR scanning and flatbed scanning. I'll link those above and below. Definitely check those out. I've got a lot of that. And if you need to take a step even further back, I've got developing videos as well for black and white and for color. Definitely go check those videos out. They'll be linked in the description. So this video is kind of a companion video with my Negative Lab Pro video that I did last week. And I really want you guys to check out that video to see how Negative Lab Pro works. I'll be pulling that up a couple times in this video, but I really want to focus on the right side of the panel in Lightroom and show you step by step what each one of those little boxes is and what they do to your photo. Now this is not an advanced Lightroom tutorial. I could do one of those in the future. Let me know down below if you want to see a full featured Lightroom tutorial with a lot of the behind the scenes and how I get really precise images. But for this one, I'm really just gonna walk through what everything does on the right side and show you how I edit my photos. Also in this video, please forgive me if there's any little sound issues. I've got a 3D printer running in the background and hopefully I've done some good audio to make it sound better. So without any further ado, let's get into the computer and editing our film photos. So first off is downloading. Obviously I'm using the M1 Max, but actually you don't need much power to run Lightroom. Lightroom gets a little intensive when you're working with a lot of photos or any complicated merging of photos, but you can kind of do this on any run-of-the-mill computer. I'm over at an Adobe. You can actually get Lightroom as a part of the entire Creative Suite for like 55 bucks, or if you're a student, you can get that half off. Or if you're a student, I think you can get Lightroom for half off. You can also try a free trial here. So Lightroom is a part of the photography package. And if we go over here to our pricing guide, you can see that you get Photoshop and Lightroom for 10 bucks. That's pretty awesome. Now there are two versions of Lightroom, and this is something we need to talk about for a second. There is one that's more creative cloud-based, where you can access your photos on different devices and on your phone. And then there's Lightroom Classic, which uses a lot more of the old style storage and a little bit older style of a layout. Personally, I use Classic. The differences between the two is not much, but the Creative Cloud that you have to pay for to do the storage and stuff. I don't like that Adobe controls all that. I like keeping my photos in my house stored the way that I want them on drives so that I can access them and not lose them in case something happens on Adobe, or you have to pay that monthly subscription to keep that storage on the cloud going. So it is actually cheaper to keep them at home. But a lot of people are choosing that Creative Cloud package where you can have them stored, and some people really like that workflow. For weddings, I shoot 5,000 photos and the price of storing that much would be nuts. So anyways, we're gonna buy and download Lightroom Classic for this video. A lot of the principles that we're gonna learn today can be done not only in Lightroom, but in any photo editing software. So hopefully if you don't like Lightroom and whatever software you're using, even on Instagram or on your phone, just editing there, you can take these principles and learn what they do in this video and apply it there. All right, we're gonna open up Lightroom now. So it's LRC for Classic. So Lightroom's gonna open your previous project. You can see here how I was working on my thumbnail for the last video. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna go up to File and we're gonna open a new catalog. It might prompt you this when you first open if you wanna start a new catalog. Catalogs are how it stores your different shoots. So of course we want to save it in a place. I'm going to save it as test catalog. And I hate saving it in pictures. I can never find it. So I've got a folder. It's my One Will Cobb folder on my desktop. I'm going to open up test catalog. And there we go. I'm going to save it right there. And it'll ask you to back up. I don't really understand the backing up stuff for this because it will save it automatically. So I've never really needed that feature, so I usually skip. All right, so we're gonna open that new catalog, and it's gonna be an empty catalog here. All right, we've got our test catalog here. Now what we can do here is navigate around, and let's talk about the navigation for a second here. Up here we have library, develop, map, book, slideshow, print, web. I don't use anything to the right of develop, just library and develop. I don't use any of that stuff because most of the time we're taking our photo, importing it, editing it, and sending it out. What we'll do is think of the library as the stuff that we brought in, and the develop is where we're editing. So we'll hit library up at the top right, and then we'll come down to import on the bottom left. So now we need to navigate and find some photos to bring in to edit. I'm gonna bring in a regular photo, and I'm gonna bring in a negative scan for our film photographers. Okay, so I've got in a Veloy scans folder, I've got my raws, I've got some already edited photos, and then I have some negatives in here that we can convert as well. So when I've found all my photos, I can check this box at the top left here where it says all photos and have them all selected, or I can unselect that and come in and choose specific ones. Why don't we choose some specific ones right now so that we know what we're working with? I'm gonna come down to the right and hit import. All right, and there they are imported in my library tab here, and you can see them all there. I wanna bring in some regular digital camera photos as well, because we'll talk about how to edit those as well for our non-film photographers, and we're gonna go import some of those. Import, I'm gonna change up my source here. I can come up here and go to other source, and it will open my finder here. Okay, so now both sets of those photos, my negatives and these positives that I have in there, are already in there ready to get going. But Lightroom does this weird thing where it will show you the newly imported ones, but the other ones are there as well. So a way to bring those back up is to come right down here where it says 28 photos selected here. I'm going to click down on this, and it says previous import. I'm gonna go to all photographs, and it will show both my first import and the new import. Okay, so that's how we brought them in with the library. Now we're gonna shift over to the development tab up at the top right that we talked about. And here we are. We are in the development tab. Let's dive in and choose a couple of these to edit. So first we're gonna start out with converting in Negative Lab. Again, I did a video on this last week. Go check that out. I'm gonna rush through this to go ahead and get this converted. So the first thing I'm gonna do is hit Command and bracket. It was upside down. I'm gonna bracket it over. You can also select this in Photo, Rotate Right, Rotate Left, but learning these key commands can help you out a lot. To start out with Negative Lab Pro workflow, we need to do a few things before we open Negative Lab Pro. I also have a link for Negative Lab Pro down below. It's an affiliate link. It helps me out a lot. If you go through there, I do make a small commission, but Negative Lab Pro is amazing, and I highly recommend it as your conversion software of choice, and I talked about that a lot in the last video. So first what we're gonna do is grab our white balance the edge. So, and then we're gonna come over, and again, we're gonna go through all these side tabs in just a moment, but I wanna go to lens corrections and distortion. I'm gonna change my bowing here just a little bit because of the way that I scan this. Again, I talked about that in the last video. All right, let's close that because we'll get to that in just a minute. Then I'm gonna come up, there's a cropping button right here. I'm gonna click that, and I'm gonna crop it as a medium format image because I took this on a 645 camera. And what I'm gonna do for that is a 4:3. Find the right spot for it, hit enter, and now it's ready to be converted in Negative Lab Pro. So I'm gonna hit Control N on this computer. It is different on PC. I think it's Control Shift N or something like that. But here we go, Negative Lab Pro is open here on the left. And it's already dialed in from how I liked it last time. So this is a digital camera scan. I'm gonna use the Frontier and 3% saturation with a 5% buffer. We talked about all this in that Negative Lab Pro video. Go watch that. I'm gonna hit convert. So it is dark off the bat. So that must mean I need to raise up the exposure. And we'll talk briefly about all this stuff. the way I start out here is I always try to find the right exposure to get started with here. Definitely needs to come up. I'll start out with a linear flat because it helps me find where my image is at and kind of make it a little flatter. Sometimes I try cinematic flat. And for this one, I actually do like cinematic flat a little better. I'll bring up the brightness here because that's another thing that needs to happen here. And so I'm rescuing these shadows a little bit, which is something that's pretty awesome with film. So I mess with those to kind of get me a good starting point. Cinematic flat is the one I'm going for. Again, I either use cinematic flat or linear flat. And so I'm gonna skip all this other stuff because I wanna jump down to white balance and go ahead and dial in that white balance. It's on auto at first. I'm gonna click on this. I'm gonna bring it down to Kodak because I believe I was shooting portrait. So when I switch that on here, it's looking a little green to me. I'm gonna play with these a little bit to try to dial that in. And that dials it in a little bit, but there's still a lot going on here. And we'll have to fix that in our regular photo editing in just a little bit. I think I underexposed this image and kind of messed up the colors a little bit, but we can bring all that back with some of the editing techniques I'll show you in just a minute. So what I go back to is lights, darks, whites, and blacks. So I'll bring up those lights again. When you bring down the darks, I might want to pump the darks up a little bit because of that underexposure. I'm gonna bring down the blacks a little bit, crush the whites just a little bit. And this lab glow, it's kind of cool to have a little bit of that on there. I'm not a big fan of the lab fade. Okay, there's that. And I do sometimes come in here and dial the highs in a little bit more. But for the sake of this video, I actually want to show you how to mess with this after the fact. So let's set these back at 0. And this looks good. And what we want to do is make a copy here. And that's how I'm going to show you how to edit in another way. We're going to apply this. So this already looks pretty awesome for film. Some film purists would say, let's leave it at that, export it, and you're good to go. For me, I like to dial in just a little bit more to true to life. For my wedding photography, I go a little bit further and do a lot more stylized, but for this one, I want to bring it back to more of a true to life look. So it made a copy here, and the copy is the one that we're going to edit our normal photography workflow on. When you're looking at the page here, you'll see on the left side is your navigator. For adjusting your image, you can come here and zoom in and zoom out. And sometimes you want to see the image from far away to kind of make sure that the whole vibe of the image looks good. And a lot of times you want to come in, you want to see the grain, you want to see the look, you want to see what's going on. So you can zoom in. I'm pinching in and pinching out as well. You can pinch in and pinch out. And then if it gets wonky, you can just come back up here to fit or fill and make sure that it's all dialed in for you there. So they've got presets here. I never use these presets, but I have purchased presets in the past and they'll show up here on the left for you. You can see a couple other things on the left here, history, snapshots. But one of the best things that I use this left side for is collections. You can create a smart collection down here and you can flag your photos. And when you're working with a lot of photos, this is a helpful way to find the right ones for you. And so if I hit 5 on the keyboard, I'll set this to a rating of 5 and then it's in this smart collections rating of 5 here. So now I know where that is. And to go back, I can come back here, come back and go to all photographs again. Okay, so that's how the left side works. Let's talk about the meat and potatoes of the right side. We're gonna go down the list and work our way through, and I've got links down below jumping to each of these sections if you wanna navigate that way. First up is the histogram on the right side. This is gonna show you a couple of things. It's gonna show you your exposure values and your exposure values for each of your colors, your main colors, red, yellow, and blue. Typically, you want skin tones to fall within 70% exposure. And you can also see in this graph that if something is clipping, which means if it's going too high or too low. And in this graph, we can see that nothing is clipping on the right and nothing's clipping on the left. That means nothing's too low, nothing's too bright. And you can see that some of our stuff is falling just a little above 70%. Now these are not rules, they're more of like generalities. You can really play around with this, and you can pull up some other scopes if you're getting really into this kind of stuff. I don't use it too much. I just use it more so for the peaking values. All right, so the next up is this original photo. I think that's a way to look back at the original. I use a key command to check that out. It's backslash. Right now we haven't changed anything. If we go back to our negative image, if I hit backsplash, it shows the negative. Next up is these 4 little buttons right here, and these are your modifiers. So the first one is a cropping tool. We used that earlier. It's pretty straightforward. You can crop in, crop out. You can set your cropping to different ratios, and I've set mine to 4:3, but you can do custom ratios as well. This is also your time to adjust the tilt. What you're trying to do with that and what these lines do when you cross over is a line will kind of come across here to kind of show you where that horizon line is. So in this photo, my horizon line was slightly off, and so when I adjust my angle, I can fix that right now. All right, and then you can constrain it to the image and reset if you need to. So there you go, that's that. The next one is the Band-Aid, and now this one is a brush that you can either brush something and it will replace it with whatever you drew. And why that's useful is not for what I just did with it, but it is to remove either blemishes, or in our case for film photography, if there is a unsightly piece of dust or hair, it's a way to get rid of it there. Sometimes I like that dust, I like the raw vibe of the film, so I'll try to keep some of that, but for the sake of this video, I'll show you how to remove some of it here. So it looks like there's something down here. We can zoom in on that. I'm pinching in. So I'm gonna deselect the brush tool here, and I'm going to pinch in and drag over and kind of look at some of the dots and speckles here. So I can see a dot right here. I can see a speckle there. And on her lip here and on her hat, there's a little speckle. So if I was really particular, I could get rid of those. It's a lot worse on some of my other images in the past. But since this one's on her face, that's definitely one we want to handle. So I'm going to grab the brush tool here. And the size is a little big, so I can go 2-finger up and down, or I can come right here and adjust the size. So I definitely want to adjust the size, and I want to adjust the feather. Now the feather is how it blends in. I want to make this as small as possible to not interrupt and be obvious. So boom. So when I hit it, it's going to pull from somewhere else. Now the opacity is how much it can be seen, and if we have it all the way up, it looks good. So it's pulling it from the hair, but for this, it kind of looks good. I can move it around, gone. So this is the one that it's being received, and it's pulling it from here. And if I hit done, you can't even see it right there. If I back up a little bit, you can't see it. And being far away, you can't see it at all. So that's how the brush works. You can do it with lines as well. I'm zooming in here. I think we saw this line right here. So I can come up, hit my brush, and I'm just gonna hold down the click when I do it and draw it over and hit done. And that line is pretty much gone. Now these are small ones. It's a lot harder to deal with when it is a bigger obstruction. You need to learn some really good Photoshop skills to get rid of that kind of stuff. But this is nifty to have in Lightroom for a quick grab. All right, the next up is red eye correction. I don't really mess with this one that much because it doesn't look good and I don't mess with it. And then finally is this masking one, and I do use this one a lot in my professional photography, or if there was some sort of uneven exposure. I'm not gonna use it on this photo, but I'll show you what it does. So you can brush something. So if, say we wanted to bring them up, we can bring up and change our size here and bring up or down the exposure on them. I don't really like doing this on my film photography, but there are times when the background and the foreground are just super different contrasting brightnesses, and sometimes you need to expose for the background. The foreground is dark, so you need to bring that up. Generally in this image, that's kind of what's happening, and I could expose just a little bit more. So let's leave that. That actually looks pretty good. So that's just the basic brush, but you can also go a little bit more crazy with this as well. They've added this new mask feature up here to kind of control your masks. So that's a great thing to have. So I'm gonna hit create a new mask, and this linear gradient is one that I use a lot to help me with skies. So I'm gonna grab it on the side here and pull it down. And now it's kind of on the sky here, and I can mess with the exposure there and bring up the exposure, and the reds tell me that it's peaking, or bring it down. But in this image, I really don't want to use that. I think that works really well for trying to balance out sunsets if you're trying to land that. So that's how that works. So those are those tabs there. Now we're going to dive into all of the tabs on the right side. Let's do it. The basic tab. Obviously, basic. This is the most basic one to help you get where you're trying to go. So your first one is your white balance. You can easily grab this dropper and find something white. Her dress was white. I can hit that, and it's gonna help us out balance this white here. It still looks a little blue. Sometimes you have to try a couple different spots. I liked that. And I can see the beginning and end of this, again, by hitting that backsplash and seeing what we've done and where we've gone. So there we go. That looks good. I can still mess with my exposure here, just like we did in Negative Lab. If we didn't like that white balance, we can dial that in some more by going to our temperature here, warm and cold. And our tint here is pink and green. So dialing that in as well. Kind of liked where the dropper was, so I'm going to push that back on there. Her skin tone, or both of their skin tones, is a little red, a little not true to life. So we're going to mess with that in just a little bit. We'll get there when we get down to some of the other things. Our highlights is how we can crush or bring up the highlights. I kind of like crushing my highlights a little bit. Exposure and contrast. Contrast is going to make it punch a little bit. The lowering the contrast is going to make it faded a little bit. You can double click on these and it'll go back to center. Again, exposure. So highlights, I like to crush my highlights a little bit, but this is a preference for anybody. And shadows are going to bring up the brightness on your shadows or lower the brightness on your shadows. And this is one of those things that gets a little uncanny if you go too bright on it. So a lot of times I'm actually going the opposite way there. So my whites are similar and my blacks are getting that punchiness. I like to bring down the blacks just a little bit to bring back that punchiness. Now, these presence ones are a little up to you to use on your own. Now, the texture is gonna add sort of a over-processed look, and then bringing it out gives it like this dreamy look. I don't touch the texture, I don't like it. I do use the clarity sometimes. A great way to test any of these features is to go full bore on both sides. Sometimes the clarity can help make something punch a little bit better, and I do like that. And on these old lenses, this dehaze actually helps out a lot. Sometimes you can bump up that dehaze just a little bit to get rid of a little bit of like lens fog from these old cameras. Now, vibrance is going to bring up sort of the vibrance of the colors, and saturation is your saturation of the colors. You can play around with these and see how they work there. Typically, I would like to go a little lower on my saturation because I just don't like oversaturated photos. So that's the basic tab. Now let's move into the tone curves. The tone curves is where you start to unlock a lot of the potential of Lightroom and photo editing. And if you can learn the tone curves, you can learn a lot about photo editing. And these are pretty standard along all of the editing platforms. Lightroom does have a different way to mess with these tone curves, but I'll show you generally how to work with them right now. So the first one here is a general brightness one that can really help you out. And when you move this, it kind of already moves the curve for you. And it's really great to have that. You can shift these over to control your regions. To look at this, the left side here, down at the bottom left, is your blacks and your shadows. And the top right here is your whites, highlights, and brightness. So manipulating this line is how we're gonna pull out all of that. Our shadows here, if you want more shadows, you bring them down. Think about this as adding or subtracting. In your darks here, you can pull that up and down. So if you want your darks to punch a little bit more, you can come on this left side and pull that up. Your lights up here, you can pull that up, you can pull it down. And generally it starts to look like an S curve if you know anything about photo editing already. But if you can look up at that histogram at the top, how it's shifting a little bit, if I want to try to hit those numbers, this is where I'm going to shoot for it. You can see that second hump there is kind of where the things are I want to hit this 75% region. And I'm messing with stuff to get there. Now you can mess with these down here that are slider variations of that, or I can reset that by right clicking on it and going to reset regions. And I can also do this in the traditional way, where I can plot my own points on here by going over to this tab, and I can do this myself, and that's kind of how it was traditionally done. And I can reset that. I can also individually do red, green, and blue and pull these up by subtracting green from the shadows or adding green to the shadows. And that's a way to kind of dial things in a little bit better if you are familiar with this. This unlocks a lot of potential and can save your photos if you see something weird going on. It's a great way to do it. You can also use this little grabber here and kind of come out here while you have one of these selected and pull in either one of them. I was saying green, but I was on blue. So that's what I was messing with just there. So if you're looking for a specific area where the blue is, I can grab blue, this little adjuster, and find me some blue to adjust. And there we go. That looks really nice, actually. Okay, done on that. And that's the tone curves. It is very complex. It's a great way to dive in and get really crazy with it. I actually like to skip the tone curves recently, and so I'll close that and come down to HSL. Now this is where I like to dive in and get really precise with my color editing. To use the HSL is hue, saturation, luminance. Now, hue is going to change the color to the left or to the right of a variance of that color. And I can show you that by making red, super red, or orange. It'll take that color and adjust it. I don't really mess with that one too much, except for actually I do use it on this backdrop. This backdrop is actually brown and it looks a little bit more light brown and pink in the videos that I do, and that's because for some reason my Sony camera makes this look green, so I have to adjust it back to make it look brown, and how I do that is using HSL correction. I don't mess with the hue that much, again, unless I'm doing something like that, but I do mess with the saturation a lot. So I'll come over to the saturation, and instead of trying to guess what color I'm trying to adjust, just like with the tone curves, I'm gonna grab this little guy and I can go choose which ones that I'm trying to adjust. And again, like we were talking about the skin, I'm gonna click on our skin and that is what we're adjusting. So I'm gonna hold it down, drag up and down to adjust it there. Now I am pulling out a lot of the warmth, but that is okay because we'll fix that in just a little bit. So I'm gonna play with that. I can't really pull too much out because that's kind of what was there, but that's starting to look really good there. All right, I can go up and hit my backslash there and see the before and the after. I know we're going pretty far with this. I'm only doing a lot of editing right now to show you what you can do. I would not edit this photo this far because it's film and I really wanted to keep a lot of the filmy aspects. I do not go this far on my images. So I do on my wedding stuff, but that's totally different. But I just want to let you know that. All right, and luminance is kind of how it says that it is the brightness of those things. So I can grab my little dropper here and mess with the brightness of their skin as well and bring that up. And then you kind of go back and forth and play with all these. Go back to saturation, grab my dropper again, pull that down. But I don't want to pull it down so that it is completely ghost-like. There we go, that looks nice. And then maybe I can bump up in the side here on these rocks because that was kind of pulled away, wasn't it? Next up is color grading. Now this one is more of a global way to look at your image, and it's kind of taken from a more cinematic approach to photography and videography. And if you're a videographer, you would be really familiar with this one. So in this way, you're trying to play with the colors that exists in the shadows or midtones. And if you think about it, we were just looking at that in the tone curves, and actually the tone curves can control a lot of these other categories. So if you learn the tone curves, you can kind of conquer a lot of things here, but it's another way to break it down. I don't mess with this one too much, but in a cinematic movie kind of thing, you would look up kind of LUTs and ideas for colors for those. So one of the classic movie ones that people do is a orange and blue. So a blue in your shadows and an orange in your highlights. Let's kind of mess with that and see what that would look like. So if I go blue in my shadows over here, you can control your kind of concentration of that and how much blue. Okay, and then in my highlights, you go the opposite. These are complementary colors. And you can just kind of dial it in to kind of get this weird cinema look here. And I don't like it that much, but that's something. You can turn off these things up here just to see them. We're gonna turn this one off. It's something I don't really mess with. All right, the next one is our detail. Now this one I do mess with a little bit for our film photography. And what we can do here, let's change our position there. You can mess with the grain of your images. So if you're using a lower resolution camera or you just have a grainy image, you can sharpen that, you can soften the grain with noise reduction, and you can also mess with the color of the grain. And I don't mess with the grain, obviously, in film photography, but I do mess with the color of the grain because sometimes the grain has digital noise in it, and I don't want that. So we can sharpen here, and you can see it does sharpen, but it also does bring out the grain more. There's without sharpening. If we bump it up, it's gonna be crazy. So I just play with this back and forth to kind of see what I like here. I wouldn't want to go that far because then it just looks like a field of grain. But without it, it could need a little sharpening. So just adding a little bit can go a long way. All right, and then noise reduction is if I want to get rid of the grain. I can bump that up, smooth out their skin, and then it's like, why am I shooting film with getting rid of the grain? So I don't want to do that. But if you have a digital image that is super grainy, you can smooth it out, and you can go too crazy with this. You can mess with the detail, wash it out. There's a lot you can do here to smooth out skin if you wanted to. We're not trying to get rid of our grain today. So the last thing is color. We're gonna zoom in even more. So you can see that there's sort of like some sort of noise in there. And what I wanna do is I wanna just switch my color slider all the way. And it just cleans up a lot of the grain for my usage, and it just looks way better. And you can dial that in a little bit more, but I always just flip it all the way up for my film photography. All right, that's the detail tab. Now moving to lens corrections. We touched on this when we were converting our image, but I'll dive into what it does here. If you've got a lens that has been known to bow in or bow out, this is a great way to fix that. Or if you've got a building in your image that is bowing a little bit and you want the lines to be straight, this is a great way to mess with it. This is gonna pillow and blow up your image. Now, we're not gonna do it on this image, but because we've already done it on this image, but this is what this looks like right there. So I'm gonna reset that by double clicking it. And this defringing is sort of, if you can see, some of the light will sometimes fringe around certain objects. It doesn't happen a lot, but is a way to get rid of it there. Then you can vignette your images by coming here and pulling that down. And what I use the vignetting for is actually the opposite of vignetting. I like to bring up whites on the side in case a lens is vignetting on me, so I can kind of combat it that way. So that's correcting our lenses. Next up is transform. Now, this is something that I wouldn't use too much, but when I'm shooting buildings, you can move your image to kind of help you with those buildings. I don't have one right here, but you can shift your image up and down all sorts of ways to dial in where it sits. Now I know this seems a little weird, but with that, you can crop it and completely change stuff. I've used this before on buildings, and I think it is a really great way to kind of reframe a subject that you shot in a different way, and maybe you wanna just readjust. Next up is effects. So this one is post-crop vignette. This is the vignetting after the lens correction. So think of the lens correction one is correcting your lens, and then this one is adding effects to it. And for you digital photographers that want to look like film, you can add grain to your image in this, and you can go crazy with this or not. You can go as much as you want. I think it really does add something to your images when you do it. For us, we shot film, so we don't need to do that. And the very last tab on here is a tab I don't use. It's called calibration, so you can mess with that if you want to. All right, so we've got our image. After I've gone through some of the stuff on the right side, I go back up to my basic tab and I kind of dial things in just a little bit more before I'm done. Again, I don't like to edit my film photos as much as we just did, but I can hit that backslash and see what it looked like before and see what it looks like now. Very processed image, but not overly processed. I like this image and I could export it right now. So let's export this and I'll show you how to get it off of here. So you can export things by coming up and right clicking on the image. All right, so I'm going to right click it, go to export and export. And then we're in the export tab here, and I'm going to kind of walk you through the settings that I use. There's lots of things you can discover in here if you're trying to do it for websites. If you're trying to do it for different things, you should definitely check out file sizes on here. YouTube thumbnails are only 2 megabytes or something, so I'll show you how I do that right there. So obviously you want to have a file system for saving it. So specific folder, you can choose your file folder. Let's choose that test catalog folder and make a test edits folder. Okay, drop it in there. And then you can do subfolders and stuff like that. The next one is file naming. Definitely want to rename it to a custom name. Let's name it Friends Photo. All right, and then if there's a video, you can do video files. So your file setting, you can change your format here to anything that you need. I typically just go JPEG, and your color space, don't mess with that. But here's the file size limit that I had checked already because I was messing with a thumbnail recently. That will limit the size to that max and base your quality on that. For now, I'm gonna turn that off and put our quality at maximum so that it's whatever size it needs to be. And then the image sizing, if you need to resize your image, you can click on this and adjust your image this way. But I leave that turned off and actually just turn my resolution to 300. 300 is generally the amount that just is the highest res, but you don't really need to go further than that unless you're doing crazy stuff. So 300 always works for me. And then you can add some metadata here if you'd like. This is what I like to do. And then I'm gonna hit export. The top left, it shows you your progress, so it's exported. I can check it out. Go to my folder here, test catalog, and there it is, right there. There's my edited photo. You can see it in all its glory. Our friend's right there. That's awesome. So guys, that's my Lightroom tutorial. It's a basic way for you guys to get going in your film photography journey or your beginner photography journey. Hopefully you were able to navigate Lightroom a little better, see how I edit a little bit, and get going with converting your negatives in Negative Lab Pro, scanning and developing, all of that. I hope I can help you with all these things in the future. That's it for this video, so let's grab our cameras, get out, and go keep shooting. Peace.